Hello. Is there anybody out there? Can anybody hear me? Let me know in the chat comments. Be funny if I'm just talking to myself here. I can see that. Oh, hello. Hi, Miles. Hope you didn't hear me singing then. Just going to wait till the minute hand ticks around to the above the hour, and then we'll get going. Hope you're well. I'm available for weddings, birthdays, bar mitzvahs, playing mean ukulele. I have a ton of questions tonight, and I am not shutting the stream down until everyone has been answered. And some are more in depth than others. This camera doesn't lie. Crikey, it's a scary look. A couple of minutes to go and we should be all right. It might just be true. Although I always think Greg manages to make himself look incredibly young on the videos, whether he has something to do with the editing. Let's see who we've got. It's just me and you, although it says 3 participants in the screen. He did actually surprise me how young he was, and that's no criticism, Greg, if you listen back to this, but I always imagine, for some reason, I go through life imagining people are roughly around about my age. I'm always surprised to find out I'm considerably older. And having just turned 50, I'm feeling every one of those 50 years at the moment. But my painting mojo is back, and I have been painting. I don't know how easy this will be to see the light. I could put the daylight on. But having a face for radio, I'm going to keep this lighting low, moody, and sort of past midnight talk show host style. But in my hands here, I have 50mm Napoleonics from Lancashire Games. They're very rough and ready casts. I don't know if you're familiar with them. Hi, Norman. Oh, a namesake. I wonder if we're related. No E like me. Yeah, it's that late night talk show host over the radio. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining me. Only in your dreams. You're north of the border, aren't you, Norman, I think? I'm sure I've seen something. Fife. Okay, we have slipped past the hour, so 6 mil after dark. Now, there's a thought. Now, I'm going to say that wrong, Norman. That because that looks like Cacaldi. I'm sure I'm butchering that. My Midlands accent can't get around those vowels. Cacordi. There you go. Well, gentlemen, thank you for joining me. I did run a quick test stream, and I had 2 different participants, which was interesting. One of which is a Patreon. You will have to forgive me. This is a little bit of an experiment in streaming. I've been meaning to do it for some time. So it's a test run to see how we get on with the technology. I am a bit of a Luddite, I'm afraid, and I struggle with most forms of IT, despite managing to get a podcast out, and now apparently live streaming to 4 people. I'll make plenty of those, Miles, don't you worry. I'm really enjoying the Little Wars TV podcast, actually. Little Wars FM. That's kept me entertained all afternoon as I've been painting 15mm Austrian Napoleonics as part of a commission I took on a good while ago, actually, probably in lockdown 1. So late March, April. Just imitating a copy pasted the link in a note so I could get it open in the YouTube app. Okay. Hello, Peponcha. Thanks for joining me. Yeah, so just stand by because one of my guests in the test stream, I don't think can get on now. Let's see what he says. It's Mr. Steve Evans. Okay. Brilliant. I don't know if anyone's in Patreon can maybe talk about that. Obviously, it's the first time I've done this, but I was hoping you'd just be able to click on the link within the post on Patreon. Oh, okay, right. So you can't participate in the chat, no problem. Okay, so it is now 8:05. Welcome to God's Own Scale question and answer session. One of the very few benefits of being a Patreon of this podcast. Some might say after this, it's absolutely no benefit whatsoever, but we'll put it out there. I intend to do this every now and then because I can't express in words how overwhelmed I am by the amount of support I've had for the podcast. Anybody who's been with me since episode 1 will know that there was a hiatus towards the back end of 2019, and I've tentatively called that the lost weekend period. So various things went on during that period that just caused me to stop. But since I was contacted by Per Broden and Peter Berry, actually, separately, I thought let's have a go at season 2, very much in the vein of Little Wars TV. And season 2 seems to be going from strength to strength because when I first stopped, I was on episode 7. Then we had the hiatus, and we're up to see episode 22, and I've got one more to publish actually, which may go out on Sunday. I may leave that for later next week, and that's a chat with Steve Evans, who I think is trying to get into the chat now. As I say, he was on the test stream earlier on. Anyhow, I'm sure he will get here. Well, thanks for listening, Miles, and it's right back at you, really, because I feel a real affinity with the guys over at Little Wars TV. You've all been very kind to me with the comments that you've all made at various times, and people reaching out to me, and I just wished I lived a bit closer, to be honest. That would be great. And you know, I'm a huge fan of Little Wars TV. Anyway. So how I thought tonight might run would be to go through these questions. Now, there are a lot of questions. I think I'm up to 30 patrons, actually. I haven't quite got 30 names on this sheet, but I guess half of the patrons have thrown in a question, which is great. You will just have to bear with me because I know Steve is desperate to get onto this. I haven't seen him appear yet, so just bear with me. What's he say? Have you comment on your post, mate? Okay. I'm sure he'll get in at some point. So yeah, I'm guessing half of the patrons have put a question forward, which I'm really pleased with. And the types of questions, thank you, Papanchi, that's great. I suspect he's struggling to get in, but thank you for that. There's a real wide variety of questions from people both new to 6mil and some more what you might call grognards, I suppose. A good English cup of tea in the middle of England, as I am. So yeah, I'd like to do this every now and then. I've got quite a few plans actually for the podcast. The last one that went out with Paul Reed was a little bit self-indulgent, maybe because it's on a topic that I'm particularly interested in and has a relevance to the game that I'm hoping to put on at the Joy of Six next year. Paul has a fantastic podcast himself called The Old Front Line, which I'm an avid listener to. And it was really valuable getting his input as a professional historian, as an author, as a tour guide, who knows those fields in Picardy in northern France and also in Belgium like the back of his hand. So although the gaming content was perhaps minimal, I really hope that the history aspect of it came over okay. In fact, when I first set up this podcast, I did talk about I wanted there to be history content as well as gaming content. So I hope that goes down well. The downloads seem to be pretty good, and it seems to have been received favorably. And I know that Paul has spread word far and wide across his social network, which is far greater than mine. So that'll be interesting if it reaches non-gamers as well. And we do talk about gaming to a lesser extent towards the end of that show. So I hope that went down well. But yeah, lots to come. I was in discussions yesterday with some people about a Christmas special, which I'm hoping to get out or certainly post up on Christmas Eve, which should be some knockabout fun, hopefully, if the people I've reached out to are up for it. So that will be interesting to see how that goes. Okay, I think without further ado, we're 10 minutes into the stream, 15 minutes actually. So we'll go on to some questions. If anybody's got any questions that they want to ask during the live stream, just post it up in the chat. I am no expert. I'm not an expert historian. I am no expert at wargaming. I just choose to try and evangelize about gaming, and in particular in the smaller scale. So just on that note, actually, Leon from Pendragon has agreed to come onto the show, and although that's 10 mil, which is as far as I would like to go away from the core of 6 mil, which is the podcast is aimed at, I think that will be an interesting chat, because I know there's a lot of love out there for Pendragon. I've got Pendragon figures myself, so hopefully it is all going well. Can somebody just type something for me just to let me know that people are still there and you can still hear me, or am I talking to myself? Still here. Great. Thank you, Paponcha. Very good. Norman, thank you. Cheers, Miles. Okay, let's crack on. So just one more thing before I go to the questions. Hopefully I'll release this as either a video on the YouTube channel or as a podcast separately. I'll have to look at how that works tech-wise. But that will be in a couple of weeks' time. As Patreons, this is for you, and you alone for the first 2 weeks, and you alone to ask the questions. So let's crack on, or we will be here all night. And one more thing. If you need to go, absolutely don't worry about it. I won't feel lonely. I'll carry on the stream and carry on answering the questions. Don't feel any obligation whatsoever to hang around all night listening to me wittering on. Okay, let's talk about 6. So the first question is from Aaron from Project Wargaming, who I know has recently been on Little Wars TV, and he will be a future guest on this show, possibly early to mid-December. Just need to sort some scheduling out around that. So that'll be great. I know he's a big fan of 6 mil, and anybody and everybody should get over to Project Wargaming to check out his channel. That Berlin build was just something else. And in fact, the interview that went out on the Little Wars podcast with the historian, and the name is going to escape me now, but that was really fascinating. I listened to that this afternoon. That man knows his stuff on Berlin. Okay, so Aaron says, here is my question. I know you and many in Great Britain enjoy gaming the American Civil War. Thank you, Miles. Colonel Gantz, there you go. In Britain, enjoy gaming the Civil War. From your perspective, what is it about that war that draws you into this period? Also, from my limited Yankee view, it seems that most in Britain seem to view it more from the Southern perspective. Does that ring true? And if so, why? Thank you for doing this. I think a Q&A will be interesting. Well, let's hope so. Okay, so the American Civil War. I think you've got to go way back in time to the origins of modern wargaming in this country, and the availability of Airfix figures, the 1/72 plastics, and those early pioneers of modern wargaming. I say modern wargaming to sort of separate it away from the sort of H.G. Wells Little Wars aspect of it, or even the Kriegspiel aspect of wargaming. When I talk about modern wargaming, I'm talking about that movement that came along in the early 60s with those pioneers like Don Featherstone, Charles Grant, who's the guy in America? There's a guy in America who did some groundbreaking stuff. Can't quite think of his name now, but anyway, those early books from Featherstone and Grant, scrubby, thank you very much, Norman, were an easy and cheap route into the hobby. And unless you were an expert with banana oil and a plasticine and a hot candle and needle, then you really had to make do with what Airfix produced. And one of the most complete ranges that they produced back in those early days was the American Civil War. So you had a box of Union, a box of Confederate, there was a box with artillery in it, and also a box with cavalry in it. So you got all three arms, which were usable for both sides. Napoleonics probably to a lesser extent, they're a bit limited. So there's only British Hussars and French cuirassiers that were released in plastic. So you'd have to be a bit more creative if you're just going to use the Airfix figures. And there would have been early metal ranges available around about then. And this is before my time, really, but the Greenwoods and Balls and Garrison, early minifigs, I guess. But how compatible they would have been with the Airfix, I don't know. But certainly with the books from Don Featherstone, as opposed to Charles Grant, who had that sort of imagination thing going on with the war game. The American Civil War was very accessible as a period that you could play. And Don Featherstone in those books, I'm looking over to my bookshelf here just to see if I can see one of them, but I think they're elsewhere in the house. Don Featherstone had very small battle reports. I remember the Battle of Platteville Valley in his book, The War Game. There was Battle with Model Soldiers, which had American Civil War battle on the front cover, actually, on a sand table, if I remember rightly. And inside, he talked about how to build up your first armies using the Airfix figures, from just having some infantry to adding in a gun per side, and then eventually adding a cavalry unit per side. And there was a battle report as he built those up using some very simple rules. And on top of that, of course, with the Saturday afternoon westerns, certainly from my experience of having the interest in the American West and late 19th century America, there was those westerns like the Horse Soldiers and the John Ford Cavalry trilogy. So I suspect that had a strong impact on the popularity of American Civil War in this country. The early metal manufacturers like Hinchcliffe and Minifigs had American Civil War ranges. Peter Gilder with the early Hinchcliffe sculpts then went on to produce a range with his other company, Connoisseur, which were perhaps really groundbreaking in the poses that were available at the time. So I don't think it's a surprise that the American Civil War became a popular period in the country. From my own perspective, and I've talked about this before, but it was really that introduction at my local club in Stoke-on-Trent, going down to, as a shy 17, 18-year-old as I was, I knew about wargaming. I bought a few magazines. I bought a few figures from the likes of Tabletop Games. I think they're Napoleonics, actually, 15 mil, with a set of rules called To the Sound of the Guns. But I saw in the local newspaper that there was a convention in the local town hall. So taking myself down to that, very excited to see actual war games and war gamers in the flesh. It was my first contact ever with people who actually did this stuff, as opposed to playing Dungeons and Dragons, which I did a lot of as a teenager. And walking into that convention hall, to the hustle and bustle of what a good UK show is, with lots of traders, bring and buy, lots of demonstration games. And I know there's a big difference between how demonstration games are treated in America as to how they are here, which is invariably an opportunity for a local club to put on a big game that they ordinarily wouldn't be able to do. And yes, to demonstrate what wargaming is to members of the public, but it's certainly it's about those club members getting to play that game and show it off, as opposed to letting members of the public join in and take part. We call those participation games in this country, and they're invariably just half an hour to an hour, hour-long games, usually a skirmish type setup. But anyway, I walked into that show and came across my local clubs, the Stoke War Games group. And there was a table that was 10 foot by 6 foot with, if you can picture in your head what would have been very good model railway type rolling scenery. So no cloth draped over hills or polystyrene hills stacked up. This was rolling scenery with the typical Civil War fencing, the snake fencing, or the post and rail fencing, with hand-built, scratch-built houses on it, scratch-built trees, walls, roads, rivers. And it was a recreation of the Battle of Chickamauga. And again, I've spoke about this before elsewhere, but it was using a set of computer-moderated rules on a Spectrum, Sinclair Spectrum 128K. And it was a set of rules by a company called Software Tactics, or SOTA. And they produced a Napoleonic set, an ancient set, a Renaissance set, and then a late 19th century set called Victoriana, and that's the set that they were using. And I fell in love with it because these were Dixon miniatures, 28mm. Oh, no, that's not it. Hold on, here it is. I actually managed to paint. Where are we? You're not going to be able to see this very well, I appreciate, but trust me, that is a dismounted cavalry officer by Dixon's, painted in contrast paints, believe it or not, painted in the other day. And I fell in love with Dixon Miniatures Civil War range, and it's still my favourite figure range to this day. 25mm, let's call it right, as it was back in the day. And over the years, I've bought and sold more of those probably than any other figure ever. And I'm still contemplating perhaps buying a few and just having perhaps a sharp practice type setup, or using Terrible Swiss Sword by the Lardies. But since that day, I've just had a huge interest in the American Civil War that hasn't abated. In fact, I'm just rereading this again. My dear old mom, who's no longer with us, bought me all three volumes of the Shelby Foote trilogy over 25 years ago now, over 3 consecutive Christmases. And I know that there is some revisionist thinking that Shelby Foote's view on the American Civil War is Southern leaning in its tendencies. But I love it. I do love it. It's such an easy read. if you see past that Southern bias, then I think it's still very relevant, to be honest. And there is some Southern bias in there, particularly Shelby Foote's attitudes towards General Lee and Bedford Forrest. Which goes on to the second point, actually, about from Aaron's question about it seems that most in Britain seem to view the Civil War more from the Southern perspective. That's a really interesting question. Just let me have a slurp of tea. It's a really interesting question because in one of my very early podcasts, where I spoke to Peter Riley of the War Games Collection Calculator, we talked about a common love for the American Civil War and how we viewed it from that lost cause perspective. That sort of glamorous, dashing Confederate officer with a feather in his hat, the gone with the wind mentality. And I had a email off somebody who's now a Patreon, actually, who's a historian out in California, to ask me to reconsider my view and stance on that. And it really made me think, because I think there was naivety on my part in having that view of the American Civil War. Now, I'm fully cognizant of, I say fully, I don't suppose anybody can be fully, but I am aware of the slavery debate, whether the war's fought over slavery or states' rights, the absolute injustice of what slavery was and how terrible it was. But I think I perhaps glossed over that a little bit in my own thinking and my own memory as to what the American Civil War was all about. And that led me to go and do some serious thinking about what the lost cause actually is, as opposed just a flippant throwaway comment, as in it's the lost cause because the Confederacy could never have won that war because their entire output of the South was less than 1/10 of that of New York State alone. That sort of angle of it. But there's so much more. If you dig into it, there's so much more to it. And some of it is very uncomfortable reading, I have to say. And it really has made me reevaluate my connection and interest in the American Civil War, which has actually gone through a renaissance over the last few figures for the Antietam scenario in Ultra Freedom. But one book in particular really made me question my own attitudes towards the war. And I'm not saying that this author's perspective or view on the war is absolutely the last word on the myth of the lost cause, but it's very thought-provoking. I'd recommend anybody to have a read of it, or at least look up on YouTube a lecture that he does talking, where I think he's promoting the book, which came out, I think, in 2015. He died in 2017. The guy's name is Edward Bonekemper or Bonekemper the third, Ed Bonekemper the third. If you type Myths of the Lost Cause into YouTube, the video will come up pretty quickly. And it talks about that gone with the wind sentimentality of what the South was, where it paints an image of slavery as something that the slaves accepted passively, that sort of home comfort feeling of the mammy looking after the children and her relationship with the lady of the house. And and also about denial of guilt and denial of blame post-war. So the myth of the lost cause came about pretty much immediately post-war, actually, with surviving Confederate officers and other ranks releasing memoirs or diaries that somehow excused their will to fight to preserve the institution of slavery and to actually talk about it in the sense of preserving states' rights. And Bonekamper really, the center of his argument is that there's no difference between the argument of states' rights or slavery, because states' rights was that the states' rights that were being protected was essentially to protect their right to continue with the institution of slavery. So it's an interesting read. I think if anybody in the UK has that southern leaning or prefers to play with rebels, then I suspect it's born of those early Civil War movies, Gone with the Wind or the Horse Soldiers, or films of that nature that sort of gloss over what was actually going on during this period. It's fascinating. It really is. Paponcha was written as a teenager from the 90s. It was the movie Glory and Gettysburg and a bunch of computer games. Well, Glory is a fantastic example, isn't it? Fantastic film. Probably, was it my favorite ever film? It's very close if it isn't. And talking about the raising of the 54th Massachusetts, really hits the nail on the head, I think, over the condition of the people of color during that war. Gettysburg, it's not in my top 10 of films. I enjoy it. I think it's great. The battle scenes are amazing. But some of the acting's a little bit stilted, isn't it? Let's face it, from Martin Sheen and Tom Berenger. That southern drawl. And there's actually a discussion online whether yeah, the beards. I wish I could grow a beard like that, crack, especially Tom Berenger's. There's actually a discussion that's was it Ted Turner that funded about his leanings, political leanings, and sort of the lost cause aspect of how that film was made. But I won't go into that. That's a really deep conversation. Really, really deep. So thank you, Aaron, for that question. So right, okay. So this next one's from Storm of Steel. Alex Sotheran at Storm of Steel, another fantastic YouTube channel, and one I think we should be considered. Or if Alex doesn't get a nomination for a Caesar, then I'm the Pope. His question is, I know American Civil War is your favorite period, how apt, and the story behind why, but what is your second favorite period to game? In brackets, I think I can guess. And what's the story behind that choice? Well, maybe. I'm far too modest, Miles. Yeah, so this won't come as any surprise at all, but and this will fluctuate actually. What my second favorite period is, because at various points the American War of Independence, as we like to call it on this side of the pond, the Revolution, obviously on your side, on the US side, that is very near the top of my list of interests. In fact, all of American history is a period that is filled with wargaming periods that I like to game. So French Indian Wars, Revolution, the American Civil War, World War II. I've got 50mm American forces for Vietnam. I've got in 15mm. War of 1812 really interests me. North Star have just released some beautiful War of 1812 figures for their second edition of muskets and tomahawks, which I'm very tempted by, but they are in those rather large scale figures. So who knows? But for now, my favorite topic is the Great War. And again, this stems back from connections that I made in the early days of my time at the Stoke War Games group, where a bunch of the older members of the club were regular visitors over to northern Belgium around this time of year, ready for Remembrance Sunday and Armistice Day, and would typically be there on the day itself, on the 11th of November, ready to lay a wreath beneath the Menin Gate. They would always stop in on or around Ypres. I was fascinated by the tales that they would come back to the club, as this bunch of guys who were 20 years older than me at the time, about the adventures that they'd had in the fields in Flanders and northern France. And then, to my great amazement and honor, I was invited on this trip along with one of the other younger members of the club, Tom Barlow, who Averill, which is north of Boston, emigrated. He met an American lady and fell in love, and now works and lives over just outside of Boston. I doubt he's listening to this, but we were both invited along to this trip, and we went for the next, I don't know, 8 to 10 years maybe. We travelled over with the group. They were considerably older than us, and unfortunately one or two became infirm. A couple of the guys unfortunately died. And the trip stopped, but my love for the First World War really stemmed from them. They were very gracious in lending me some of the seminal texts on the Great War. There's also the fact that at school, my history teacher was one of these charismatic guys that can just stand up at the front of the class with no notes and have the entire class eating out the palm of his hand as soon as he opens his mouth, including the rebels on the back seats who were throwing rubbers at each other or whatever. He was an amazing guy, and my history course in high school was Modern Europe 1870 to 1939, so it was right up my street. The rise of Germany and then the rise of Hitler. That great interest came for the Great War, and wargaming wise, didn't actually start wargaming it until Peter Pig released their second edition of Square Bashing, and I helped out on the playtesting of that. Very good friends with the Peter Pig team and Martin Goddard down in Weymouth, and enjoyed it immensely, and went on to paint up 6 armies, 3 late war, 3 early war for that. I think World War One is one of these. Oh, sorry, the First World War. I must stop calling it World War One. That's you get slapped in certain quarters for saying that. It's one of those periods that was always thought very difficult to game, but Peter Pig managed it with their square bashing rules. It's certainly more at the game end of wargaming than any sort of recreation, but certainly gave plausible results, and it's a divisional level game played out on a 4x3 table. Don't know if anybody's familiar with it. I still really enjoy that game to this day. It's really an interesting game. However, I came across Great War Spearhead 2 early last year, I think it was, prior to starting the podcast anyway. Started to read some of the battle reports on that and some of the research that had gone into the writing of those rules. I know guys at the Little Wars TV group have played some of this back in the day. I don't know if I've seen your face on any of the pictures, Miles, on any of the battle reports, but I've certainly seen you, the club playing out Great War Spearhead in God's Own Scale. So that really has captured my imagination for the last 18 months or so. And I am building the Battle of Mons from August the 23rd, 1914, which is the British Expeditionary Force's first engagement on the Western Front. So the figures are all painted for that. The buildings are mostly done. They're just over to my right here. Got a few more buildings to do, and that one is ready to go as soon as lockdown finishes. It's an 8x5 table, which is a bit big for my office, actually, where I am now. I've got a 6x4 table in here. But I could certainly play it in the dining room downstairs, or hopefully at the club when the club reopens. Come on. We need that club reopened. And as well as that, I have the forces for the Tietval scenario in the Great War Spearhead 2 rulebook, which hopefully I'm putting out at Game Joe 6 next year. So I've got most of the figures. I think I just need to buy one more division of British. I've got all the trenches from Timecast, which are beautiful. Got an idea how to do the scenery. But not actually put paintbrush to figure on that one yet. But certainly after Christmas, and certainly when I know, or we've got a better idea whether or not shows are going to be back up and running next year, pending COVID, obviously. Okay, Alex, hopefully that answers your question. So next one, we've got Dominic White, who says, my question relates to the usual megalomaniac tendencies of wargamers to build and deploy vast armies, which as I get into sixes is definitely a thing. How can we create large games that avoid as much as possible the sacrifice of tactical detail for strategic play and still have a playable game which doesn't last days? That's a really interesting question, because the two rule sets that I'm currently building armies for, so Ultra Freedom and Great War Spearhead 2, are what would be described as grand tactical. Certainly where Ultra Freedom is concerned, you have a brigade represented by one base of figures. And that base is on a 2-to-1 ratio, and typically in 6mm, that'll be 60mm by 30mm. And you can represent the unit in line with some skirmishers out front. Which is what I want, and that's the sort of game I want to be playing. And there's other rules out there that do a similar thing, such as Volume Bayonet, the Polymos sets from Bacchus, and one or two others out there as well. But in doing that, then I think you're moving away from what Dominic says there, where you've got that tactical element, that smaller tactical, those smaller tactical decisions of formation changes and formation changes is probably the main one, actually, because obviously if a brigade is on a single base, there's no room for march columns or extended lines or whatever, forming square, that sort of thing. And for me, I think that's about the position that I want to be as a player. Who do I want to be representing on that table? Do I want to be representing a brigade commander or a divisional commander, or do I want to be the corps commander or the army commander? And certainly for games like Great War Spearhead 2 and Ultra Freedom, which are taking up most of my time, although Volley and Bayonet is very much back on the cards, I think, as I've got tempted into a Borodino project at some point next year. But I want to be that corps or army commander. And as a corps or army commander, it's not your business sending orders out to a brigade to tell them what formation to take. You rely on your brigade commanders and your regimental commanders, and to a certain extent your divisional commanders, to ensure that the troops under your command are in the appropriate formation for the battlefield situation. I'm not saying that you can't do that in 6 mil. Certainly playing games like Fire and Fury, you've still got that element of granular control of your troops. And Fire and Fury is a game that I've played a hell of a lot of. I did do years ago. Not played it recently, but where you've got one base of figures which is usually about 1 inch wide by 3/4 of an inch and 3 or 4 figures on it, and a brigade might be, I don't know, between 8 and 10 bases. You're able to form those supported lines or march columns or whatever, attack columns, and have that granularity of detail. But I think, and I may be wrong in this, and please comment if you think I am, but in my opinion, Fire and Fury is a step down from that Grand Tactical game. Although it's a brigade level game, you're commanding brigades, organized into divisions and corps. I know a corps, you might have 2 or 3 corps on the table. But in Ultra Freedom, certainly in the Antietam scenario, I think you've got 4 or 5 corps on the table with an overall army commander, obviously George Brinton McClellan. So I think you can have those large games, but you've got to make a decision as to what level of game that you're representing. Grand Armée, another game there, and Blucher, actually, by Sam Mustafa, where you've got one base representing a brigade, whether as in Grand Armée, that's a 3-inch square base like Volley and Bayonet, or that playing card size base, that's funny size base that Blucher do. It's not a square, it's definitely a rectangle. But if you need to decide where you're going to pitch yourself as the player, being represented on the table by army, corps, division, brigade commander, which one do you see as being you as the player? And that's where you will make that decision over what sort of rules you're talking about. Pipuncha says there is Fire and Fury Brigade and Fire and Fury Regimental. Not that I've played them, but I suppose Fire and Fury Brigade is on the same scope as Ultra Freedom. Yeah, the regimental rules, I'm not familiar with them. I did own them actually a while ago when they first came out. I thought they were pretty complex. I never picked them up. So I can't comment on that. You may be right there, Pipuncha. They may be on that same scale. For me, I think they're one step down, because you've still got, in Fire and Fury, you're still making that decision over formations and the minutiae of where each base is going to be and within the formation. So, but it's certainly very similar. It's on the same theme. Hi, Alex. We have asked your question already. I do apologise, mate. The Great War, which I'm sure comes as no surprise. Been listening in the war room on my phone. Well, there you go. Sorry, mate. Yes, I should read the second part of your post. That's interesting. It's in the war room. Okay, so that's Dominic's question. And we've got next a rules writer, actually. David C.R. Brown of General de Brigade, Pickett's Charge, soon to be O Group, being published through the Lardies, I think. His question is technology and game realism, question mark. I've now played a few games of Chain of Command using FaceTime, etc., and found it a different experience in that you can't judge distances or even see situations very well as the umpire's phone hovers over the battlefield. As I was more remote, I felt more like a platoon commander, giving orders from a position where I couldn't see everything, nor judge every range perfectly. Do you think this sort of gaming experience could be onto something? Now, Alex, I know that you've taken part in a couple of these virtual Lardies days, and it looks like you've had great fun doing that. I think that's a really interesting point that Dave makes, that in some ways you get that fog of war experience, that you haven't got the God's eye view of the table, and you're relying on pictures that you can see through somebody's phone down your screen, which might be missing something off to the sides. So Alex says, yeah, they were great, and you do have that fog of war for sure. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting concept, and I know a mate of mine, Adrian Delves, I don't think he's listening, or I don't think he will be listening, is experimenting at the moment with a setup at home, so we can do that. Obviously in the UK, we're in lockdown too, so face-to-face gaming is completely out. But it's a really interesting concept. And of course, you don't even need to get dressed to play a war game, as a thought. But yeah, you lose that God's eye view of the tabletop. So it limits your view. I suppose it gives you a bit of tunnel vision almost. And you're relying on the umpire or the guy with the phone in the room where the table is, pointing the phone in the right direction. And also, if you're giving instructions as to where figures are to move, then they might not quite go exactly where you want to. So it creates a little bit of that friction, which I think is really interesting. So Dave, I certainly think it is onto something. It's not something I've experienced yet, but I've followed certainly Alex's experience of, I think it was Dux, correct me if I'm wrong, Alex, Dux Britanniarum, certainly on one of them. I think it's a really interesting concept. Even lockdown aside, it's something that could be explored. It was Dux. It's something that could be explored more. And in fact, it allowed the other bonus, obviously, lockdown pushed to one side, is that gamers can play a war game, a tabletop war game, no matter where they are. So Miles, you in the States, and Norman up in Scotland, and Alex and myself, we could all play a game. And by the looks of it, a very good game, very enjoyable game. So it's something I'd like to experiment with, and if I get the opportunity to participate in. So maybe on the next virtual Lard Day, I need to get signed up and get in on the action, although my internet connection isn't the strongest here in darkest North Staffordshire / North Shropshire. Okay, so Graham Bevan, long time listener to the podcast. He's got a couple of questions. The first one should be easy. Do you consider Cold War wargaming, Cold War gone hot, historical gaming? It's speculative rather than factual. And secondly, it's more about the podcast itself. I know it's really 6mm historical, but would sci-fi be something you would talk about? I ask because there's a real renaissance of 6mm sci-fi manufacturers and rule sets right now. So it's not just the GW-inspired epic stuff. Thanks for those questions, Graham. Yeah, absolutely. So Cold War gone hot. Well, we can't say it's historical gaming other than the fact, if we're talking about those games that are set in the 80s between NATO and Warsaw Pact, we can't really call them historical. They are sort of counterfactual speculation. They are conflicts that could have taken place but didn't actually take place. So I perhaps wouldn't call them historical gaming. They're not science fiction gaming. They are what-if games, aren't they? They are what could have happened. And there's been mountains of research into what could have happened during that Cold War period certainly in the early 80s. I remember reading a book called The Third World War by, I want to say, General Hackett. I may be wrong there. Can't remember the author. But I think it ends up with a nuclear bomb going off over Birmingham, I think, which was then retaliated against, and then that was it. It was all over. It's not something I've ever done, actually. Thank you, Hackett. Yes, I thought it was. It's not something I've ever done. I've always been intrigued by it, and I think my only contact with it was at the old Derby World Championships that used to take place at the Assembly Rooms in Derby in October, which used to have a room full of competition games going on, usually 6th, 7th, or Ancients from WRG or DBM later on. But then there was a group that were playing, I think, Challenger, which was one of these really complex, hundreds of charts and factors for loading your weapons, that sort of thing. And my image of it is a green painted piece of chipboard, 6x4, with painted on towns and roads. There may have been some very low relief hills in the sort of stepped style, and just loads of columns of micro armor tanks winding their way down these painted on roads, and nothing ever seemed to happen. There's always huge arguments as well. That was the best bit, actually, watching the arguments. So yeah, I don't think we can call it historical gaming. Just got some visitor in the room. You all right?
Yeah.
You're going to bed?
Yeah.
There's people watching me.
Okay.
You're going to bed?
Yeah.
Good night. No, night. See you in the morning.
In the morning.
Sorry about that. That can shut the door for me.
Sorry about that.
But the second part is asking me whether or not I would talk about 6mm sci-fi. Well, why not? I am primarily a historical gamer, but I've played a hell of a lot of fantasy and science fiction games over the year. I'm a huge Mantic Games fanboy. I love the stuff that Mantic produce. I'm a big supporter of them in the shadow, as they are, of the great Leviathan of Games Workshop in Nottingham. I've got masses of armies and figures and board games and what have you from Mantic. I haven't done much with it recently, I have to say, but 6mm sci-fi, Well, if anybody wants to talk to me about 6mm sci-fi on the podcast, I will do so. It won't be a regular thing at all, but as a one-off, I absolutely would, because wargaming is a broad church, and we should not be ignoring what's going on. It might not be for us, but I think we can all understand that we're in the same hobby, and that certainly some of the painting and modeling skills that goes into science fiction and fantasy games is equally as good as what we see in historical games. People are just as passionate about science fiction as fantasy as they are, as other people are about history. Mike Stocking of the Wargames website does a lot of 6mm sci-fi. Yeah, there's a lot of it out there, and I've got a friend of mine, Keith Knight. He's got just about everything Games Workshop have ever released since day one, and has got a figure collection that I've painted figures, not just figures in boxes, painted figures from Games Workshop and armies from Games Workshop that I think I would defy anybody in the world having anything any more than he has. He's just got the most incredible collection of armies and stuff. But on point, he's got a massive Epic collection, and I've played Epic with him. Don't know which version. I know there's various versions out there: Net Epic, Epic Armageddon, etc. And I do actually like to read the 40k novels from time to time. I've read quite a few of those. I love the background, but I've always thought that the normal 40k game doesn't live up to what you read about in the novels about these huge battles with thousands of space marines and orcs or whatever clashing. It doesn't seem to recreate it, but I think Epic can. So Graham, if you want to talk to me about 6mm sci-fi, or I get onto Mike Stocking maybe, or somebody else, then yes, I'd have a science fiction and fantasy special. I think let's call it a special and a one-off, because I'm a historical gamer at heart, but I don't want to close the door to anybody that wants to speak to me. Miles, if you're still here, I've reached your questions. I do. I'm Norman, you're coming up next. Oh, that's great. That's good timing. I do apologize, Miles. You've had to wait an hour and 7 of interminable droning on. I hope you're doing something interesting with your time whilst you're listening to this. So Miles from Little Wars TV says, I'll submit a few questions. One, are there any periods that you think we need more 6mm ranges of and selection? I'll answer these in turn. Yes, I think we do. There's not an awful lot of 6mm on offer for interwar years. So Spanish Civil War, for instance. Spanish Civil War is a conflict. I've always had a fascination with civil wars, the American Civil War primarily. But any civil war, what is it that turns a nation on itself? So the English Civil War is a huge period of interest for me. But the Spanish Civil War, possibly more so because of it was that precursor to World War II, where the fascist forces were supplied and advised by Nazi Germany, and then the Russian influence assisting the left. But any sort of deeper reading beyond what you might get in a school textbook, for instance, just tells you what a terrible conflict that was. All conflicts are terrible, don't get me wrong, but if you read some of the books by Paul Preston or Hugh Thomas or Anthony Beevers, actually, is a very good one-volume history of the Spanish Civil War. It's really a tragic period. And the interesting thing is that, of course, the fascists dictator Franco only passed away in the mid-70s, I think. So there was a fascist government that way outlasted Hitler and Mussolini. But yeah, I'd love to see some more. Irregular Miniatures do Spanish Civil War, but I love Irregular Miniatures. I do, but it'd be nice if there was a bit more out there. Vietnam as well and 6mm. I know GHQ do some. I'm not a big fan of. I won't say that. I choose not to buy GHQ. Irregular Miniatures again do 6mm Vietnam. But I think we're pretty well covered. If you look in any of the 6mm manufacturers' catalogues, starting with Heroics and Ross, crikey, there's not much that they don't cover. Irregular do cover everything. I suppose variety of pose is something. There's an argument that do you need a variety of pose in 6mm when you're playing grand tactical games? They're not really designed for skirmish games, although I would argue if you want to play skirmish games in 6mm, then why not? Why not play a Western gunfight with 6mm? Who's to stop you? It's your decision. It's not ideal, obviously, and you might lose some of that aesthetic that you can get with some of the beautiful 28mm stuff out there now. But if your budget is limited or your space is limited, then you absolutely can play a 6mm Old West skirmish using Irregular Miniatures again in their posh packs. They do some very nice individually mounted cowboys. Belgian Revolution. My God, I've never heard of it, Peponcha. Sorry. No, I couldn't guess as to when that was, why it was fought, or what they were revolting against. Whether it was it against Leopold? Probably not. If 1830, I don't know. That's a real gap in my European history, I'm afraid. So yeah, I don't think there's a lot. Maybe sounds like Peter argument for limited ranges. Yeah, maybe just some different poses. So, for instance, I'm painting up hundreds of American Civil War Union and Rebs at the moment, but there's really just that. Well, there's three poses. Let's say there's the infantry in the march pose, and then you've got skirmishers in a firing pose or a loading pose. So there's three sort of main poses. Adler, I know, do some lovely sculpts that Steve, I don't think he's managed to get onto the chat, unfortunately, but he's just recently started to paint up. He's just recently started to paint up some Adler, and there's some various poses there, but so maybe that's just because Bacchus don't do more and they were the figures of board. Anyway, okay, so Miles, number 2, is the current trend of skirmish type rules and figure sets, bolt action, blood and thunder, for example, a good or a bad thing for interest in the 6mm side, which traditionally isn't used for skirmish level gaming, or can it? Well, there you go, 6mm Wild West skirmish, why not? I've talked about this on the podcast actually before. And I think, well, why not? And it's something that I probably should do as an experiment, just to say it can be done. It can be done. If you want to do it, yeah, you can do it counters, can't you? For example, War Games figures, whatever size they are counters. They are 3-dimensional counters, admittedly, but they're counters. So you could replace them with a cork bottle or an old. That is a vintage Games Workshop pot of paint, isn't it? And it's not dried up. That is yellow wash. Why anybody would ever use that other than to put a figure on that they're painting, I don't know, because I don't think I've ever had any use for. But yeah, you can use anything, can't you? For aesthetic reasons, we use three-dimensional figures that are beautifully sculpted by whoever our favourite sculptor and range of figures is. But so a 6mm skirmish, absolutely not out of the question. But is the current trend of skirmish type rules a good or a bad thing for the interest in 6mm? I think they serve different purposes, and I don't know who said this first. Somebody did fairly recently. The bigger the battle, the smaller the figures. Peter has seen this, I think, in the increase in demand. I remember when I bought my first batch of First World War figures from him at the Phalanx show last year, which would have been June time. He was saying that demand was just going through the roof back then, that there was a real exponential growth in the amount of trade he was doing in 6mm, and his theory was that people are coming around to the realization that if you want to fight Waterloo, Alex, with your fantastic 6mm collection, if you want to fight Waterloo, then the days of, for most people or most clubs, of doing that in 28mm, I'm not saying they're gone, but there's more alternatives out there now where you can do it in 6mm or 2mm or 3mm or 10mm. So, and don't get me wrong, I love to see a huge 20-foot table crammed with 28mm figures. But if I'm walking into a war game show, just 4 years of your life, it was worth it, mate, though. Get those Prussians done. If you walk into a war game show, never having war game before, but you think, oh, this looks quite interesting. And the first table that you see is a 20-foot table with 28mm, thousands of 28mm painted figures on it and beautiful scenery, etc., etc. You can walk up to one of the people and say, this looks great. How do I get into it? And Alex has said there 4 years of his life to paint up his 6mm Blucher armies for the Battle of Waterloo. Well, you can imagine what it would be for one person to do a solo project in 28mm to that sort of same scale. Well, it's nigh on impossible, I would suggest, unless you're employing professional painters and commission painters. As club projects, obviously, that's a different scenario. If you get 2 or 3 people involved in it, then one can do French, one can do British. But I do think that with the greater availability of the small scales now, that these battles are now in reach for all of us to play at home on our tabletops. So Borodino, for instance, you might just play in 28mm in the big, or the Chevrodino Redoubt. In 6mm, with some of the modern rules as well, I'd still be waiting if it was my mates painting the French. I've been there before, Alex. I'm with you, mate. In 6mm, you can fit the whole battlefield on a tabletop at home fairly easily. But having said that, these skirmish games like Bolt Action, Blood and Plunder. I'll show you one I've just picked up myself. The Chicago Way, because Great Escape Games I've got a very limited edition 2-player starter set, and Gangsters have always been where it's at for me. Old West not so much, but Gangsters. So I played the hell out of Gangbusters, the TSR role-playing game back in the 80s. Loved it. I've always had a fascination with Gangsters, so that was a little treat to myself. And yes, I'm playing that in 28mm, or I will be once I've painted them up. They've absolutely got the place there, Miles, I think. We are a broad church. I overuse that phrase, but I stick by it. And I don't think they are mutually exclusive. I don't think one will hurt the other. I think because people can see exactly, Miles. That was my attitude. It's a Wild West game with Tommy guns, isn't it? So what's not to like? I think in the starter set I've got Prohibition, Agents, and Gangsters. So I'm really looking forward to having a go at those and getting perhaps a few of those buildings from TT Combat, just 4 or 5 of those. That'll look absolutely great. So I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I don't think that this current trend of skirmish rules is a good or a bad thing for interest in 6mm, because I think that interest for those big games will never go away. And those big games are now far more achievable because of the availability of 6mm figures. As Alex testifies to, I know it took him 4 years, but I think if there's 2 of you doing that, or 3 of you as a club project, then you could get Waterloo done in perhaps 12 months even. And Bolt Action in particular is an interesting one, isn't it? Because I think that's almost one of these, what might be called a gateway game into historical wargaming. I played Bolt Action, I've enjoyed it. I know there's critics out there for it, but to be honest, there's not many war games that I haven't enjoyed that I've played. If somebody puts a game on down at the club, I'll be more than willing to jump on and have a go. If I'm rolling dice, moving some figures with some mates, then what's not to like? But Bolt Action is that, it seems to be that that gateway game for Games Workshop players to jump over from Games Workshop and be their first experience of historical wargaming. Black Powder to a lesser extent, because you need quite a few figures, don't you, for Black Powder, even though it's the Rick Priestley heritage on it, which people trust as a well-known rules writer in the hobby. So I think they're great. I think these skirmish games are great, and I've played a lot of them. Sometimes you don't want to be fighting Borodino or Antietam. You want that quick game that you can throw down figures on the table. And as I say, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. You can play Bolt Action 6mm. I'm sure there are people that do that. You can play Waterloo in 28mm, but not every day of the week. Okay, so question 3 from Miles. When putting on a game, how should a GM distribute their effort between miniatures, terrain, and rules scenario? Is it a straight third of each, or does one aspect have more weight than the others? My personal opinion is the weight is minis 20%, terrain 50%, and rules 30%. But then again, I'm a terrible painter. I'm sure that's not the case, Miles. That's an interesting one, isn't it? Because the model that we have at my club is certainly one person will provide both sides, the rules, the scenery, take that game down to the club and see who wants to take part in it as that game master. Now, this is different strokes for different folks, isn't it? If your skill is in figure painting, but not necessarily in the scenery building side of things, or scenario building, then you're going to put more effort into those figures. I think personally, I'm probably terrain on the smaller percentage side, so maybe 20% terrain, and then an equal split between rules and miniatures. For the last God knows how many years, traditionally, games that I've taken down to my club have been Peter Pig games. So Hammering Iron, Square Bashing, Civil War battles, Age of Samurai, the battles in the Age of War. What else have we played? PBI, their World War II game, the Spanish Civil War game, Long Ships, the Vikings game. All of these, in fact, because I've been friends with Peter Pig for a long time, Martin Goddard, got a lot of the figures, been on the playtesting team. Every time they've started to develop a new set of rules, I've ended up collecting both sides and the scenery to put a game on down at the club. And that's occupied a lot of my wargaming history for oh gosh, 15 plus years, I would say. Gosh, that's a long time. So, and their games are ideal for that 2.5 hour window down at the club. They definitely err more on the game side of wargaming, as I've said before about Square Bash. But Martin will always look to get 4 or 5 unique aspects of a period rules as the focus. So I remember when Washington's Army was being developed, the American War of Independence or Revolution, however you want to look at it. The aspect of how the militia reacted. So this idea of they would let off a volley and then fall back, but then reform and go again, or give another volley. So he was keen to get that aspect in. The preponderance of flank marches, that was an aspect that he wanted, the opportunity for a flank attack. So I've really gone off on a tangent, I do apologise. But what I'm saying is that, so for me, it would be painting up those 2 Peter Pig armies, and I am a base coat dip or base coat ink kind of a guy. Years and years ago, I would be Kevin Dallimore style, black undercoat, base coat, middle coat, highlight, or even 2 or 3 more highlights. But when the army painted it, I can remember this very vividly, actually, being at the Partisan show at the old venue of Kelham Hall, which was a very grand, stately home venue in the middle of the Nottinghamshire countryside, but it was very dingy, very low lights and what have you, and lots of rooms off down corridors that were unexpected. So you could be at the show all day and then stumble upon a room that you hadn't seen all day, and there's a fantastic display game going on. But at the Partisan show, I found Army Painter had just released their dip, sold by Warlord Games, who literally just released their first plastic Romans. They just started, and I bought a tin of the oil-based dip, painted it on rather than dip my figures into it, and they revolutionised my painting for many years. That did. I was knocking out thousands of figures a year as opposed to hundreds. So I'm very much a base coat, and it's a wash now as opposed to dip. But so I would paint 2 armies, and I would do the scenery. So they would be nice and nicely based with flags, etc. I was really proud of those figures and those armies, actually. The scenery would be less of a consideration, so that's where the 20% would come in. So I might use felt templates for woods or roads, that sort of thing. But it still looks a really nice game. I like to think that I put on a decent game, and then whether we're playing a scenario from one of the rule books, one of the historical scenarios, or the typical Peter Pig setup game where you have this pre-game which determines who's going to be the attacker or defender, and then will deplete the defender's army slightly. So the attacker has really got to get stuck in and hopefully beat the defender before the defender's reinforcements come on, that sort of setup. But yeah, interestingly though, for the Antietam game and the Somme game, I think that's probably a far more even split. That's interesting. I'm going to think about that. Okay, Miles, hopefully that answers your question. Crikey. Right, Norman, if you're still there, of the Clark clan, I'd be interested in your views on rules for 6mm, and in particular the solo gamer. This pandemic has rather brought solo gaming to the fore, but while I have no views, I wonder how many who would describe themselves as war gamers are in fact regular club gamers. My own position is not, and the nearest club is, I think, 15 miles away. My gaming tends to be with 2 friends who were in a club I did go to, but which folded some years ago. Draw 6 is a beacon and a generally near solo year to which I go from 5. interesting one. Well, we've got Alex with us, who has done an excellent video on solo gaming. Norman, I'd highly recommend you get over to Storm of Steel and check that video. Check all of his videos out; they're all excellent. But there is one on solo gaming in particular. A few ideas there. I'm sure you've got your own ideas, Norman, as you say. But so solo wargaming is something I've got a bit of a love-hate relationship with. There's many a time where I've gone to the effort of setting up a solo game thinking it's far better to get the figures out on the table. If I've, even out of lockdown, if I've got nobody available to come around to my house or come to the club, far better to get my figures out on the table and roll some dice, and then thought, oh, I can't be bothered, and then put it all away again. On other occasions, I've had a very enjoyable time. In fact, I played some AK-47 solo earlier in the first lockdown. In fact, I put up on a different YouTube channel called Billy Goat Wargaming. Billy Goat, Peter Pig, if you get the link, where I tried out both AK-47 all sets, AK-47, the original set, which there's a great fondness for in the community, and then AK-47 Reloaded, which was a vastly different game. It was supposedly the second edition of AK-47, but it was a vastly different game. I actually enjoy AK-47 Reloaded very much, and enjoyed the games, but my photography and camera skills are pretty embarrassing. So please do not look up Billy Goat Wargaming. I know somebody will do, but yeah. So it's an interesting one that people who go to clubs, I love my War Games Club. I've been a member there for 30 years now. There's a great group, a wide variety of interests, some really interesting people there from all walks of life. It's great that when you walk in the club, you can hang up any angst, or if you've had a bad day at work, hang it up at the door, come in, roll some dice, play with figures, and pick it up again on your way out. And hopefully the burden is slightly less because you've enjoyed a game. But how many gamers are in fact regular club gamers? It's difficult to say. I mean, all of the gamers that I know personally are members of my... Well, that's not true, actually. All the local gamers that I know are members of my club. And other people that I've met around the country, they all are members of clubs. Actually, that isn't true. That isn't true. I do know of one or two people that just game at one person's house once a month or something by special invite round to his house. Interestingly, he's the guy who ran the Chickamauga game at that War Games convention back in 1988-89 when I first walked in and was blown away by it and hooked on the American Civil War ever since. He still games, but just at home with and he sends out personal invites to take people around and play the American Civil War with him. He's still fighting the Civil War. The Joy of Six is a beacon. I agree. The number of times I've been there, I absolutely love it. It's got a unique feel from any other war game show, I think, in that there's a common interest in the small scales. All the manufacturers are geared up towards 6mm. The games are always amazing, whether it's a small game like... There was an absolute crazy game, and Alex, I know you were there last year. There's an absolutely crazy game called Brexit, the Riot Years, or Riot, the Brexit Years. I can't quite remember what it was. Two really eccentric older guys playing this game. It was a set of rules called Riot that Irregular Miniatures released, 20 odd years ago, set around a riot caused by Brexit. There was that game which was played on, I don't know, about a 2-foot square table. And then you got Per Broden's Poltava on, I think, 16-foot long table full of 6mm goodness. But Joy of Six is just an amazing. Yeah. That was my attitude as well, Alex. It was. I did sit down. It was a participation game, and I did sit down at it with my friend Adrian, and we didn't know what on earth was going on when we sat down, and we were none the wiser when we got up from it and made our excuses and left. Norman Clark was in a club for a while. The person running it had published rules, Napoleonic, but my moves meant I left and have had an extended time without club gaming. This is different strokes for different folks, isn't it? If you've got 2 regular gamers, Norman, that come around to yours, or you visit them out of lockdown, obviously, and that is sufficient for you, that's fantastic. It is. We are a broad church. Gatekeeping is something interesting. That's a topic that for another day, maybe. But this idea that I can't play with you because you play 28mm Napoleonics, and I'm not willing to look at 6mm American Civil War, or these rules are best, and if you don't like these rules, then you can't play with us. And then there's more. There's deeper gatekeeping, isn't there, which I won't go into. But all I can say is my club is a community to me. One of my best friends there, he was the best man at my wedding. We've been through ups and downs together as club members. A few years ago, we lost a real dear friend of ours to cancer in the prime of his life, who's still remembered to this day, Martin Smith, Six Smith, as we used to call him, for his uncanny ability to roll the 6 at the right time. We've seen each other grow up, get married, have kids. Some of those kids have become members of the club. We're a real close community, and this lockdown and the first lockdown, we haven't met since first lockdown, so around about beginning of March, actually. And we are still in touch over social media, and we have an occasional D&D game online, which I quite enjoy, or other role-playing games, actually. But I miss those guys terribly, and I can't wait to get back and see them. Okay, Andy Shaw. My question will be this. As a noob to 6mm wargaming, but not wargaming in general, my current dilemma is basing. I don't want to rebase my figures for different rule sets. So what size should I choose for squads, units, and vehicles? Yes, a controversial subject, but I think 6mm vehicles should be based. They should be based. That's my perception. That would be the most flexible. Andy, I'm going to, again, I apologize for this, Alex. I'm going to point him towards your channel because you play Chain of Command and I Ain't Been Shot, Mum, which are 2 different scale of game, principally with the same figures. I know some of the recent figures that you painted, you've been basing some singles, but you certainly use multi-base figures for Chain of Command. I think that'd be, and judging by how you phrase that email, Andy, I would say that you're looking at World War II gaming, or certainly modern gaming, where you're talking about squads, units, and vehicles. 6mm vehicles should be based, I think. If you're basing your figures, base your vehicles. Otherwise, I think the size looks, to my eye, looks a little bit out. But again, that's just my preference. But certainly for games like I Ain't Been Shot, Mum, where you do have individual figure removal, there's absolutely no problem with basing your figures in groups of 2 or 3 or 4 even, and just using a counter, a dice, or 6 or 7 figures. That's absolutely fine. some way to represent the losses of figures. Those buildings you've been doing, Alex, are really impressive. I've loved looking at those ones that you've been tarting up with the brick work paper. They've been very good. So I wouldn't worry about basing. I wouldn't worry about basing. Too many people, I think, worry about basing. Find a rule set that you think will be your principal set of rules and base your figures for that. And if it is that you want to go into a sort of a lower level squad skirmish type game with individual figures, then certainly in 6mm, the investment is tiny, isn't it? But if you're looking at Chain of Command, if you're looking at I Ain't Been Shot Mum, and 6mm is the actual ground scale for I Ain't Been Shot Mum, then basing your figures 3 or 4 or 5 or however many, and just use a counter to mark casualties. It is a dilemma. I ponder over these things. There you go, the 1, 2, 3 basing, yes, from Papontia. So Andy, get over to roller1.com, which is Per Broden. Hi Per, his excellent website. And that's basing, so that would be 6 figures based. You've got a single figure, and then 2 figures based on one base, and then 3 figures on another base. So you've got 3 bases with 6 figures on, and you're able to chop and change. But yeah, you could base them all as 3 to a base, no problem, and just use a counter to mark casualties. Okay, moving on from Andy, we've got Little Wars TV. Never heard of them. Some small outfit, I think, across the pond. Just joking, guys. A few more questions submitted from guys here at the LWTV Club. Beyond Those Miles has already asked, what wargaming related podcasts do you find yourself listening to most often? I was a real early adopter of podcasts, and I can remember having conversations with people wanting to talk about podcasts I'd listened to, but people had never heard of them. 2 of the very earliest podcasts were Meeples and Miniatures from around about 2008, I think. Still miss those guys, Neil and Mike. And also the D6 generation. Now, Miles, as somebody on the other side of the Atlantic, I don't know if you're aware of Craig Gallant and Russ Wakelin. They're from the Boston area, and they ran, and they still actually do, but it's in a very different format now. They ran a podcast called the D6 Generation, which at times ran on for 3+ hours. It was an amazing effort. It was a general gaming podcast, principally science fiction, fantasy based. I'm not sure they did any historicals, actually, come to think of it. Lots of board game reviews, lots of movie reviews, video game reviews, but it was mainly tabletop gaming. And I absolutely love that show. But they ran for something like 10+ years, and then called it a day, and now just release very short podcast, 20 minutes, 30 minutes long, that sort of thing, which they call D6 Pips, which I think is an interesting one. Other wargaming podcasts, well, of course, there's the Oddcast, which is just brilliant. I love their output, even though I know virtually nothing about World War II. To misquote General Grant, as I posted somewhere, I can't quite remember the last couple of days, but to misquote General Ulysses Grant, I can only recognize 2 tanks. One is a Tiger and the other isn't. That's about the limit of my knowledge of World War II. So yeah, the Oddcast, Henry Hyde, of course, his podcast is always interesting. He has some great guests on there. Across the Pond Wargamers, there you go. That's a new one, or a relatively new one to me. I think they only started this year actually, but get on to Across the. Now I know Alex has actually been a guest on Across the Pond, as have I. But Gary and Colin Grimes, they do great work. That's a really good podcast that's really getting in step and very interesting. Wargaming Recon, of course, with Jonathan. Veteran Wargaming with Jay. There's lots out there. There really are. We're spoilt for things to listen to and content. I very rarely listen to the radio these days, only if there's something interesting in the news. And well, there's not much interesting going on in the news, is there, at the moment? I joke. Yeah, so lots really. What are some of your favourite podcasts that have nothing to do with history? I don't actually listen to any podcast that has nothing to do with history. In Our Time is a great podcast from the BBC with Melvyn Bragg, but that's historical. No, I occasionally listen to a football podcast. That's Soccer, to everybody across the other side of the pond, from the BBC. But no, it's almost all historical. What are your top 3 bucket list battlefields you haven't visited but would love to see anywhere in the world? It would be very easy to say all 3 are in the States, because although I've been to the States, I've never been to on a battlefield trip. So it would be very easy to say I've seen a lot of battlefields across Europe. It's interesting, isn't it, that a lot of the major battlefields of the wars throughout history have taken place in quite a small area of land in northern France and Belgium. So the Somme, the First World War battlefields, the Somme and the Ypres salient, Waterloo, Malplaquet, Agincourt. These are, you could throw almost a postage stamp over a map and cover a lot of these battlefields. Okay, I've got to go for Gettysburg, because it's, well, as a lifelong Civil War nut, it's the defining moment of the American Civil War. I know that's up for debate, but in my eyes, it certainly is. And Miles, you've beaten me to it, because the second one would be Antietam. And I know that misses out any of the battlefields out in the west, like Shiloh or Chickamauga or Murfreesboro, but I think Antietam and Gettysburg would have to be the first 2. And just so I'm not naming 3 American Civil War battlefields or American battlefields, I'd go for Isandlwana, which I know Little Wars TV Steve went to, and I loved his video of his trip there and the game that came from it. Yeah, Gettysburg, Antietam, Isandlwana. So that's the 3. Have you ever wargamed with paper figures, and what are your thoughts on using paper figures? No, I haven't gamed with paper figures. But these books from Peter Dennis, they are intriguing, and I would never rule that out. I know Steve, who I don't think's managed to get into the live chat tonight. He has played English Civil War using the paper figures. And it's certainly a cheap option into the hobby. I remember at Partisan last year, it would have been the May Partisan at the Newark Showground. The author of the rules, there are rules in that book, aren't there? But certainly Peter Dennis was there, another couple of guys, and they got it was the Spanish Succession book, and they got a 8x6 table just filled with these paper soldiers. It looked amazing. But yeah, I think they're absolutely a valid route into the hobby. They're a cheap way to get into a period. The Age of Sail set, I'm assuming it's a Napoleonic booklet with sort of Trafalgar type ships in there. That would be great. But yeah, I think they're great. The artwork is amazing. I think there's a company that will produce those in a sort of clear perspex as well to give you some heft and solidity to the paper figures. And of course, there's the Little General. Is it called Little General? Little General website where you can print off just about any paper figure as you want, whether it's a top-down view of a figure like a counter or a standee type figure. I've often wandered onto that website and thought, have I got enough printer ink to refight Gettysburg? Okay, Henry Hyde, another name that I'm sure is familiar to everybody here. Let's just have a look at the chat, actually. Antietam is the nicest. Miles, and then from Norman Miles, it was Antietam I liked the most. Gettysburg was rather a forest of memorials, but a couple of years ago I did the battlefields of the Civil War. So you've done the three that I'd like to do, Norman. That's fantastic. Interestingly, Miles, I in an idle moment and think about my Battle of Antietam scenario, I went on Google Earth and gave myself a virtual tour of the battlefield on Google Earth. That was fascinating. It's not something I've done before of a battlefield, but I'd highly recommend it if it's a place you've not visited and you want to recreate the battle that took place there, to get on Google Earth, because it's great. Certainly, Google Earth normally takes you down roads or up streets or whatever, but there's the little blue line that you drop the little man onto is all over the battlefield, so you can get into the sunken lane and to the West Woods and then down to Burnside Bridge. It's really good. Highly recommended. Henry Hyde, oh dear old Henry. Here we are entering another lockdown. How important is your hobby and the community? Oh, Steve, where have you been? Oh God, I'm so glad you're here, mate. So glad you're here. Thank you for joining us. Yes, Henry. So how important is your hobby and the community supporting it to you in terms of maintaining mental health in these strange times? Have you found that the pandemic has affected the type of projects you decide to take on, or has it given you more time to focus on the ones you already have? Yeah, so if anybody listened to my interview with Henry Hyde on his podcast, not his interview on my podcast, I talk quite a lot about mental health and my own struggles with it. I won't go into it now. But this hobby and the community is a big part of, it's a wider support network, I think, is the best way to describe it. Certainly through the podcast and through other things, through other contacts within the hobby, I've had people reaching out to me from all over the world, really, and got to know people that either virtually or in person that ordinarily I would never have met, and had the benefit of their friendship and compassion, I suppose. But my hobby is very important. I remember listening to an oddcast a good while ago where Nick Skinner said he can easily wake up first thing in the morning and think about wargaming, and then think about wargaming pretty much constantly throughout the day until the point where he goes to bed and goes to sleep. And that can be me. I can get quite obsessive with it. I don't know if obsessive is the right word. It's just that constant interest, that constant thirst for knowledge. So when I'm saying I'm thinking about wargaming, generally I'm thinking about which book I want to read next, or what figures I want to paint next, or what project can I start and then not finish and move on to something else. But I think the best way to say is it's a constant companion for me. So if I'm having a bad day at work, and there's been a few of those recently, I can have 2 minutes just checking Twitter just to see if something interesting been posted on there, or I can have a little think to myself about what I might paint when I get in from work, or spend some time reading one of the mountains of books that I've got. It's a constant companion. You're never short of something to do with this hobby. Whether it's painting, research, playing, thinking about it, building scenery, you're never short of something to do. And if you get bored of one project, then we've all got other projects that we can move on to. And we can get inspired, can't we, by Twitter, by Facebook, by podcasts, by films, by friends who've started a new project, and you think, oh yeah, I'll have a little go at that. So has the pandemic affected the types of projects you decide to take on, or has it given you more time to focus on the ones you already have? Well, like many people, I've worked all the way through both lockdowns. So my life essentially hasn't changed within lockdown, other than the lack of the ability to go to the club. That's been the major change for me. So time for projects hasn't changed. So I've got a 10-year-old daughter, and I've got a wife, and I've got a house to maintain on top of a full-time job. But there's been a real renaissance in my hobby over the last couple of weeks. And I've really managed to focus down into the Antietam project. So I bought the figures for that at Partisan last year, and they've sat biding the time. I think I painted 1 or 2 bases up in the meantime, but now I'm 28 Union Brigades and 12 or 13 Red Brigades in, so I need 44 Union Brigades, so another 16 of them, and I need 36 Red Brigades. That's the bag to do. So that was 2.5 kilos of 6.5 figures, all for Antietam. And I cannot express how much I'm enjoying painting them figures. I've really got into stride with them. I find when painting a figure that you've not painted before, it takes a little while to get to know the figure, get to know how the sculptor has created that figure, the pose, where the various bits of equipment are. But once you've got over that hump, then it's all plain sailing from there on in. My figures aren't museum pieces, absolutely not, but they're to a standard that I like and I will be proud to put on the table. So I'm focusing more on that project that I already have, Henry. I've had some crazy ideas actually over the course of lockdown. So I got very much into a couple of couple of blogs, and I can't remember for the life of me who they were by, but there's a guy who does a lot of Blucher using Heroics and Ross Napoleonic figures, and I suddenly had a burning desire to do Borodino using volume bayonet on a slightly reduced scale, so using 2-inch bases instead of 3, which reduces the table size down from 9 foot down to 6, which will fit in my office. Whether that sees the light of day, I don't know. I did manage to I can't quite reach them. I did manage to purchase a few Heroics and Ross French Cavalry off eBay, so I did say no more projects this year. And next year, I've already got Blenheim in mind using Twilight of the Sun King. I've got the Somme game at Joe 6. And there's something else in there as well, which will probably be enough. I also want to boost up my Antietam forces to Gettysburg, so there's not a big jump from the figures that I will have painted for Antietam to be able to play Gettysburg. But Miles, that sense of forward movement is important during these times when we feel our world is out of control pandemic-wise. Absolutely. The craft aspect of the hobby lets me feel I've accomplished something during a day, even when it's just a bit of... Yeah, that's true. I think Alex on Storm of Steel did a video about 15 minutes, painting for 15 minutes a day and seeing how much you could get done in 15 minutes. Preparation is the key, I think. There you go, the 15-minute challenge. Preparation is the key. I've now painted all of the American Civil War figures that I've prepped. So I think over this weekend now, I'll be prepping the next batch of figures. I've got this 15mm commission that I need to get finished as soon as possible. Ideally, by the end of next week, I want them done and sent off to my fellow club member. But I will get the next batch of the American Civil War prepped and ready, and I will prep enough that I will be able to come in from work after a busy old day where I'm feeling pretty jaded and tired, and I can perhaps come up in the office and sit for half an hour, and maybe I can paint one base of American Civil War easily in 30 minutes, 25 minutes or so, so long as they're prepped and ready to go. And the longer I leave it without having figures prepped, that's when my projects tend to grind to a bit of a halt. So, yeah, it's preparation is the key. Okay, Dominic, we're getting through these now. So, Dominic White, another question to do with our waste-led mountains. We all have odd figures, broken figures, some painted figures that will never see the painting station. I know different companies use different alloys, but surely there's something we can do as a responsible hobby to recycle our unused and unloved lead rather than dump it in a landfill. I don't know the answer to that because I've never dumped any figures in a landfill. I might have to take a pass on that, Dominic. I'm sorry. Surely there's something we can do as a responsible hobby to recycle our unused and unloved lead. I'm going to plead the fifth on that, Dominic, because I've never thrown figures. I've certainly gotten figures that I've unused, but I tend to sell on eBay things. In fact, I'm seriously contemplating a big purge of the piece of pig stuff that I've got at the moment, because some of it I've not had on the table for years, and I generally regret it the moment I sell something. However, I can't just keep acquiring stuff and not let stuff go, because I will run out of space eventually. So Papunch says, my question has already been answered. As a total newcomerish, I find it hard to get started. Alex, I've been thinking about exactly the same thing. How recyclable is the leftover plastic from kits? That's an interesting one. I'm certain there was something Games Workshop were doing about that, because obviously they have mountains of sprue left over. Might be worth speaking to somebody at Games Workshop, probably at Warhammer World, something like that, Alex. I'm sure this question was raised in one of their forums or one of their Twitch TV shows. Got any Elf Drakon Riders you want to sell? Steve, I do have Elf Drakon Riders. I've got 3 of the original ones, and no, I don't want to sell them, mate. Steve, just to let people know, Steve is a person I consider now a good friend. He's somebody I've met through the Mantic community. He's a top fellow. We've played a couple of times face to face, haven't we, and chatted and communicated over the last couple of years or so. But he's, as well as being a historical wargaming nut, he's an absolute Mantic fanboy like me. So I think part of it is backing the underdog. It's that English spirit of wanting the underdog to win, and Mantic are in the shadow of the Leviathan that is Games Workshop in Nottingham, and punch way above the weight. I think Mantic have got something like 22 employees at their headquarters in Nottingham, compared to something like 2,000 or 3,000 Games Workshop employees and £1 billion turnover. But no, mate, I'm not selling that. Right. Let me just put the light on. Bear with me 2 seconds. Oh my God. So when I talked about going to the Stoke Club for the first time and getting into American Civil War, having seen that Chickamauga game at the convention in Stoke 30 years ago, the Stoke Club is, or used to be, we used to have permanent premises above an old hardware store, and it was all flats really, or bedsits is the better way to describe it. And there was in the first floor of this building block. And as a club, we took over these rooms, and people would play American Civil War in one room, Napoleonics in another, fantasy role playing in another, that sort of thing. But the picture I'm going to show you now is the group that I used to play with. So I am this young fella here. I'm probably 22, 23 in that picture. This was my good friend who passed away a couple of years ago. This guy here made all this rolling scenery, 10 foot by 6 table of American Civil War goodness, and all Dixon figures on there. He's the American Civil War nut who still plays American Civil War, but you have to wait for an invite round to his house to play it. And going back to one of those first questions about the British people seem to have that bit of a southern leaning, he definitely got a southern leaning for the Confederacy. And then probably, and I've said this before, his name was Jeff Davis. Now, I don't know whether he changed that by depot or something, but this guy here, his name's George Hughes. He's passed away since, but him and this guy here, Jeff White, they were 2 of the older members that eventually I got invited to the trips over to Ypres with. Very knowledgeable ex-Grenadier Guard George was. He was a governor at Nottingham Prison. Jeff was a detective superintendent, and he's got a painting company that's all over Facebook, and I forget what it's called. Flames of War painting or miniature figure paintings. Some there. Can't remember what battle it was. Right, okay, where were we? So we're nearly there, guys. We're nearly there. Single. figure. So I'm afraid I will be asking a lot of elementary questions. For lots of reasons I won't bore you with, I've decided to move to a smaller scale for my future wargaming, and 10 mil is equal, by which I mean, can you mix and match various manufacturer castings easily, or must you stick with one manufacturer to avoid weird looking units? Oh my gosh. Unstable internet connection. Okay, I think are they all equal and the same? Yeah, my internet connection isn't fantastic, I'm afraid, but it's okay, so I think Bacchus and Adler mix in the same armies. I've seen 6 mil armies with the regular miniatures and Bacchus and Adler in the same armies as well. Irregular are older sculpts, aren't they? Older molds and slightly perhaps smaller than the Bacchus and Adlers. But I think if you look at the 3-foot rule, or from table distance, let's say, then I think you'll see very little difference. And I'm sure there are people out there that use Heroic and Ross with Adler or Bacchus, and Heroics and Ross are actually very well proportioned, but as a result of that are quite thin and spindly. But I've actually got a real liking for the Heroics and Ross. In fact, Jeff Davis, who I pointed out in that picture there a few years ago, gave me all of his Heroics and Ross American Civil War. And it was a massive box of them, but to my shame, I've never done anything with it. And then when I chose to do the Antietam project, decided to go with Bacchus, but I really ought to do something with those figures. They are very nice. Associated with this question is the question of scale creep. Are 6 mil figures getting bigger? 60 years ago, crikey, 60 years ago when I started gaming, 30 mil was the norm, but they progressed to 33 mil, then 25s became the norm, and they grew to 28. 15 mils went to 18 mil. So our 10 mil becoming 13 mil and 6 mil going towards 9 mil. Yes, I would guess. I think Bacchus is still pretty much true to 6 mil, maybe edging towards 7 mil. Adler is certainly that little bit bigger, chunkier. They've got those the very nice figures, but I know traditionally their heads are a little bit bigger, which might push them up towards 8 mil. I can't answer around 10 mil so much. I know Callistra, sorry, they are more like 12 to 13 mil. The package is 10 mil, but they're more 12 to 13 mil. Whereas Pendraken, I think, are pretty consistent at 10 mil. I also wonder why every scale seems to go up 3 mil, but that's not a question for you. And my last question, at least for a while, is how do you base your units? I've always used metal bases for my larger scale figures, which meant that the figures became the handles by which they were picked up with associated damage to the figures. A friend of mine uses 3 mil MDF bases for his 25s, but a 3 mil base under a 6 mil figure seems a bit much. I'll stop now. Thanks for that, Jim. Jim Getz. I know that Robert Dunlop, who I interviewed back in episode 3, he gets very thin plywood bases from Litco. No problem, Alex. Thanks very much. I really appreciate it, mate. Thanks for popping in and contributing. He uses very thin plywood bases from Litco, which means that the figures are almost absolutely at table level. I do use the MDF bases from Pendraken, which are either 2 or 3 mil. I think from the top down angle, actually, I don't think it matters. I know what you're getting at, Jim, that if the base is half the size of the figures, yeah, Steve, 2 mil. I think mine probably are 2 mil actually. But it does give you something substantial to hold on to when you're moving the figures around. You can almost make, certainly the type of games that I'm looking to play, the Ultra Freedom, you can almost make those 60 by 30 mil bases mini dioramas. I've seen people put trees on there or bits of wall or fence or a log or something. And in 6 mil, I do think the basing is even more important than at the larger scales. I think for a 28 mil figure, a well-painted 28 mil figure with an average base, you get away with. But I don't think you can get away with it in 6 mil so much. Maybe a bit contentious, I don't know. But yeah, I use the MDF 2 or 3. I think it is 2 mil. But I know what you mean, Jim. Yeah. Okay, last 3 questions then. We're nearly there, team. It's only 2.5 hours into the stream. Benny Mikhailson, I'm going to say. Hi, Benny. Thanks for joining me. Or thanks for supporting the Patreon. I follow Wargaming News, have a subscription on WSS Magazine, listen to your podcast, but have not completed any miniatures since I bought a starter set. Find it difficult to find the time to sit down and paint. How do you find the mojo for it? Well, if you could bottle the mojo, I think you become a very wealthy man in wargaming circles, because I think just about every gamer goes through periods where the mojo waxes and wanes. And I am a perfect example, because I can sometimes go weeks without touching a paintbrush, just not getting the energy, motivation, enthusiasm to sit down. And I think this comes back to the prepping that I was talking earlier. If you've got stuff prepped, it's so much easier to come and sit down and do some painting, rather than thinking, well, I've got nothing prepped, so I can't be bothered. Alex, who's just left from Storm of Steel, talking about that 15-minute challenge where try and get 15 minutes done a day, and you'd be amazed how much that builds up over a couple of weeks. That's always a good thing to try. Even 10 minutes sat down at your table and maybe putting a couple of colours on. At least you're making some forward progress in whatever your collection is. I find it very difficult to force the issue. I think you have to wait for that motivation to come back, or that glimmer of motivation to come back, to get started again. I don't think you can really force yourself into it, because well, you won't enjoy it for one, or rarely will you enjoy it. For two, you're probably not going to do your best paint work on it, because you're probably not concentrating as much as you need to. And three, this is meant to be a hobby. It's something you're meant to be enjoying taking part in. So forcing yourself into it is counterproductive, I think. So just wait for that inspiration to come. Don't force it. 10 to 15 minutes, you'll see some progress if you do 10 to 15 minutes each day. And then really, like myself, over the last couple of weeks, I've really found the desire to sit down and crack on. And I've painted hundreds of 6mm figures in the last couple of weeks, which is really pleasing, particularly when you look at the end result. And you get, as Miles said, you get that real sense of achievement. Ian, hi, Sean. Sorry for the late entry. I'm a returning gamer, 30-year gap. Where have these people been? These people who haven't been gaming for all these years, what have you been doing? But love 6mm. I get the sense that 6mm and possibly 10mm are gathering a much bigger following My question is, how do you see the next 5 years for 6mm? And will that, in its turn, attract more manufacturers to the scale, keep up the great work? Partially answered this already, I think. I think, for me, I think the biggest change we're going to see in wargaming, not just 6mm, is the availability of quality 3D printers, whether that's resin or whatever the other one is. I don't think we're at the stage at the moment where we can print figures of equal quality to what we can buy through the traditional routes at the moment. Certainly scenery, buildings and what have you, and vehicles actually. I think we're almost there, if not there already. But figures, I don't think we're there yet, but crikey, I anticipate within the next 5 years, then we certainly will be for printing figures at home. I think I can see 10, 15 years down the road, the model will be that sculptors will provide us with the STL files or their own designs for you to print off. And most likely there'll be some colour ability in them. So even painting might become a thing of the past. Don't know that, but I suspect at some point in the future you'll be able to print off very nice coloured figures. And finally, Steve. Here we go. Steve Evans. Hi, mate. A couple of questions. First, if time or money was not an issue, what conflict would you love to gain? As the host of a 6mm podcast, I'm going to say something heretical now. Because of that nostalgia pull of those Dixon 25mm American Civil War figures. I would love the order of battle for Gettysburg to a 1:20 scale. So you'd be looking at 20 to 24 figure units, I suppose, on some beautifully sculpted terrain in a warehouse that I can invite all my mates to. I think if money was no object, I think it's time, actually, time more than anything. But do you know what? I think I'd still prefer, because you can have these massive games planned out. And I know you've done Waterloo, Steve, haven't you, in your village hall? And quite often they won't live up to the anticipation and all that hard work. And I think, although I've not actually played yet, but I've done a lot of research, carried out all due diligence around this, I think Altar of Freedom, Altar of Freedom is going to be the rule set I've been looking for 30 years to enable me to play the big battles of the American Civil War in a reasonable time, around a reasonable sized table with a reasonable number of friends to a conclusion. Because with all the will in the world, if I've got, I don't know, 20-foot table full of Dixon miniatures, I suppose I could use Altar of Freedom for them, but I don't know. That is a really interesting question, Steve. There's Battle of Blenheim's another one. So it's a battle that really fascinates me. In fact, the whole career of John Churchill fascinates me. But that might be a project next year, or probably will be a project next year in 6mm. Secondly, is there any conflict you could see yourself never gaming, and why? Oh, yeah. Oh. I don't think so. I don't think there's any conflict I wouldn't game. There might be conflicts and ranges of figures that I've got no desire to collect, but if somebody else bought them, painted them, put them on for me, then I would practically play anything. There is one school of thought where we perhaps shouldn't be gaming modern theatre combats where there's still conflict going on. So Afghanistan, Iraq, that sort of thing. I don't have a personal issue with it, but I know some people will take a moral stance on that. I love the Fallujah episode of Little Wars TV, for instance. War Games Developments, which is a group in the UK. I presume they've got some worldwide reach. I don't know, but they are into perhaps more abstract styles of wargaming. Paddy Griffiths and people of that, Arthur Harmon, people of that ilk, I think, had some involvement in war games developments. I seem to remember there was a discussion over a war game set in Northern Ireland during the height of the Troubles, and that caused some raised eyebrows and discussion. But no, I don't think there is any conflict I wouldn't game on moral grounds. One interesting one, and this was at Partisan a couple of years ago. There was a participation game for a set of rules. I think they're called aggro. Certainly the figure range is called aggro, and it was sold by Antenacity. Never been able to pronounce it. Do a lot of sci-fi scenery. And it was representing football hooligan violence in the 70s. So you've got a football pitch and stadium, and then some of the terrace housing streets around it with police officers and hooligans fighting. Most of you will probably know I'm a police officer. I've been in some of those situations. That one smacked of bad taste to me, to be honest. Interestingly, the guy that was running it and the guy that had written the rules was a police officer, a retired police officer. But I had a discussion with him about it, and I think that one just was a bad. Yeah, so I wouldn't play that. But I think that would be about it, really. We're at the end of the questions. My throat is raw. I hope that's gone okay. I hope so. I've really enjoyed it. It's the last 2.5 hours has flown by. I've got to thank all of you that have joined me and kept me company. I still find it incredible that I've got patrons. It's really humbling. Thank you, Miles. Thanks, Steve. It's an interesting journey running a podcast. Cheers, Norman. Thank you. But it's something I'm really enjoying doing. And not in any sort of egocentric way. It's just something I love talking about the hobby and talking to interesting people within the hobby. And I am humbled by the fact that at one point there were 6 people in the live chat listening to me rabbit on about these things, and that people trust me with their money to keep the podcast going. So thank you very much, guys. This has been an absolute blast. I'm going to put it up on the Patreon page for probably a couple of weeks, and then if I can work the technology out, I may release it to the wider public. But that's that's something for the future. I'm not sure if I'll get that done. Next episode of the podcast is with Mr. Steve Evans, who's in the chat now. Hopefully, that'll be either out Sunday or maybe early next week, I think. It's a lovely chat between me and Steve, just waffling about the hobby, a little bit of a different one to the norm within the previous episodes, but we have a right good old chinwag, as we say down here. Yes, you, mate. Right, it is 10:30 in the UK. What's that? 5:30, 4:30 in the US. Miles, especially to you, mate. Thank you very much for joining me. It's a real honour to have you join me. Keep up the great work. 5:30. There you go. Keep up the great work that you're all doing over at Little Wars TV. It is a real great window into the hobby stateside, and my absolute favourite production YouTube channel. Whatever, it's fabulous. Right, I am going to bid you all adieu. Thank you for joining me, and keep talking about 6.